Welcome to the Red Story. If you like, subscribe. I will understand that everything is not in vain. John sat in shock, listening to his fiancée finish her statement, and anger filled his body. John was driving Jenny to their usual date when he asked if she wanted to take a week off and go camping with him after her college classes ended in a couple of weeks. Jenny replied, "John, you know I'm leaving the day after classes end. Rachel, Emily, and I are almost packed and ready to go. We're heading out west for the whole summer." "Jenny, if you think I'm going to let you do that, you're crazy. I thought when we got engaged, you agreed not to go on this darn trip. What made you change your mind?" "Oh, John, I never said that. You know we've been planning this trip since we started college. We saved every cent we could to pay for it, and we'll still have to work a little during the trip unless we can find someone to help cover our way. Do you know how hard it was to cut expenses and inflate them to get more money from our parents for the trip? How could you even think for a minute that I'd miss the trip of a lifetime, Jenny? I know what happens to your two friends when they leave home. I also know how they find someone to help pay for the expenses they can't cover themselves. When they have a drink or two, they lose their senses and end up in compromising situations. Jenny, I don't want you hanging out with them here, let alone spending the summer with them 24/7. You jerk. These are my best friends. I'm not going to let you talk about them like that. Sorry, sweetheart, but it's a done deal. You knew when we started dating that I planned to go on this trip. Nothing has changed. You go off on your short National Guard tours, and I trust you. What's the difference here?" "Jenny, you know the difference. I'm a civilian soldier. I go on training and active duty if and when I'm called. That's part of my job. When I'm there, I'm mostly working. I don't have time to run around after girls, even if I had the inclination. If you go on this trip, we won't last long. Even if you don't plan to cheat on me, you'll get drunk and slip up, or those two will persuade you into it. I promise you this will end us. I'm not going to let you walk out like this and expect to come back and find everything the same. Do you want that? Are you trying to break up with me?" "Oh no, honey, never. You're my main man, and we'll be even after this little trip is over. We'll go out and see the good old United States. Then I'll come back to you and be your personal woman for the rest of my life. Jenny, I better be your only man. If you go on this trip, you will never be my woman again. I'm not going to tolerate you sleeping around with whoever and running around with those two." "Oh, silly. Of course I'll be your woman. I told you I would come back home. You'll be my main man. Now forget about it. I don't want to talk about it anymore." The rest of the evening passed in a blur for John. He knew they went to the movies as planned, but he couldn't remember what the show was about or anything else they discussed. Most of the time during the show, he thought about Jenny, her friends, and her insistence on going on the planned trip. He also recalled some statements she had made over the past year while they were dating. They had a certain disdain for him and displayed a selfish attitude. John was horrified to realize that the credits were rolling and people were leaving the theater. Jenny stood up and took his hand to leave. They didn't stop for dinner or drinks afterward as usual. John just drove Jenny straight home, walked her to the door, and turned to leave. He stopped when she grabbed his hand and pulled him back. "John, what's wrong with you? We didn't stop for dinner and drinks like we usually do, and now you're just going to leave me at the door. Aren't you coming in as usual? I was really looking forward to you staying over again." "No, Jenny, I'm not coming in. I don't know when I'll come over again, if ever. You need to decide what you want before I do this again. But for now, I promise you one thing. If you go off with your friends like you planned to this summer, I promise you, you'll never see me in your house or your bed again." John walked away. Jenny reached for him again but missed. She ran 3 steps after him and then shouted, "John, you didn't even kiss me goodnight. Why are you acting like this?" She stared at him as he opened the door to his truck and looked at her over the roof as he started to get into his old Ford Ranger. She screamed, "To hell with you, John. Just go off and sulk. I'm going on this trip, and that's final. When we get back, we can set a date for our wedding. Now get over it and stop sulking." Jenny turned and was closing her front door as John drove off. She looked at her 2 best friends in the world, who were standing there watching her. They both smiled. Emily said, "I guessed he didn't take it too well, huh?" Jenny shook her head, then smirked. She said, "Darn right he didn't take it well. He always does that when I insist on something. Besides, he knows he couldn't find another girl like me." She laughed and continued, "Sure, if I ever find out he slept with someone else, I'll make sure he doesn't have sex for a long time." Shelley laughed and said, "And how do you think that attitude is fair?" "Shut up. You know I don't share my man." Emily laughed and said, "You shared Jake with me on Wednesday night." "Well, that was just a one-time thing. John is my man, and I'm not sharing him. The other men in my life don't concern me. I'm not marrying any of them. I'm just having fun." "So, where are we going to make our first stop, girls? I think maybe Butte or Bozeman, Montana." I want to ride a cowboy before any more educated idiots get between my legs. John never called Jenny or visited her before she went off on her trip of a lifetime with her friends. The day after their supposed departure, he could stop by her home to ensure she had left. The apartment was empty. He drove to Jenny's parents' house to see if she was there. He didn't want to spend money on gas, but he wanted to verify her presence or absence physically. After all, it was just a little over 100 miles away. His little four-cylinder Ranger got almost 26 miles per gallon, so the expense wouldn't break him. Besides wanting to ensure Jenny had indeed gone on the trip, he needed to return all of Jenny's things she had left in his apartment. He had no intention of ever seeing her again, and he sure didn't want her personal items around his place. When John reached Jenny's parents' house, her father told him she had gone on her trip as planned. From the conversation, John gathered that Mr. Stevens was no happier with his younger daughter than John was. It took them about 15 minutes to carry her things into the house and stack the boxes in her bedroom. John shook her father's hand and drove away, heading back to his lonely apartment. John was 2 years older than Jenny, but he was a year behind her in college. He had just earned an associate degree in construction management. He planned to get a bachelor's degree in project management and start his own construction firm after working for a few years. He was also a staff sergeant in a National Guard engineer company. Working part-time, getting his bills paid by the Army, and getting his reserve pay, John had managed to get this far in college debt-free. Sure, he lived in a dump, but he was paying his way. He had no close relatives and no savings, so it was either pay as you go or accumulate a large debt to pay for college. When his parents died, his father's construction company had gone bankrupt. All their savings and property were used to cover the expenses of the car crash. The only thing John got from the family on his father's side was a small 80-acre plot of land outside the city. His grandparents left him the land when they passed away. There was no house on the land. There was a small old building where a few pieces of ancient equipment were stored. When he went to his farm, he would camp out in a machine shed or by a beautiful little stream in the cave. After returning from Jenny's childhood home, John terminated the lease on his little apartment. He took all his belongings to the farm and camped out there. He still attended reserve meetings and the 2-week summer camp, but otherwise stayed on his little piece of land. At first, he just lounged around, fishing, swimming, drinking, and feeling sorry for himself. The pity party lasted almost a week before his funk began to lift and he resumed exercising. After all, he was a staff sergeant in the reserves. He needed to stay in shape to perform his duties properly. After 3 weeks of doing nothing, John got bored. He went into the machine shed and inspected all the equipment. He knew the old tractor would start. He had used it fairly often to brush hog the patch over with bushes and grass. It was still early enough that he could plow part of the land and raise a late crop of soybeans. He knew he'd have to hire them all together, but heck, it would be something to do, and he could make a few extra bucks. John hooked up his plow and headed to the field. He had only made a few passes back and forth when one of the neighbors drove up and stopped. The neighbor got out of his truck and stood watching John work. When John approached him, he stopped his tractor and walked over to the neighbor. The man asked, "Oh heck, I was bored and remembered Granddad used to raise a little bit of soybeans. I thought maybe I'd plant a few beans. I think I can get them harvested this year." "Yeah, son, you can if you plant short-season beans. You'll probably get a decent crop, but why are you plowing? Heck, nobody plows much anymore except for gardens. We mostly just spray and kill the grass and weeds without tilling. It saves time and money. It also adds humus to the soil, protects from erosion, and helps hold moisture for the crops. Not much more than you're going to raise here. I could loan you my no-till equipment if you'd like. Of course, if you break it, you have to pay to fix it." "Well, I don't know, Mr. Jeffers. I'm not planning on making a habit of this. I wouldn't know how to use it." "Well, as high as some of those weeds are, you probably ought to brush hog first, then use Roundup to spray and kill the grass and weeds. After that, you just use my no-till drill like your old grain drill and plant the beans. Get the Roundup ready seeds so you can spray them again after they get up a little and you're good to go. If you decide to raise corn or wheat next year, do the same thing." The rest of the evening, John pondered Mr. Jeffers' words. It would certainly save him a lot of time and fuel if he could plant no-till. He decided to give it a try. He had an old spray rig, and he thought. Early the following day, John began mowing the field with his little equipment. It took him 4 days to get the job done, but he did it. When finished, he hooked up his disc and smoothed the tilled part, then went to the neighbors to see about borrowing the no-till drill. He had already purchased seeds for his crop. When John arrived at Mr. Jeffers' house, he found him working in his machine shed on the big, heavy drill. John grinned and got out of his truck. He walked up to Mr. Jeffers and extended his hand for a handshake. He said, "Good morning, Mr. Jeffers. If you're still willing to loan me your no-till drill, I thought I'd borrow it. I want to no-till the beans in this crop and check it out to see if it's better and cheaper for me to do that or plant the old-fashioned way. Heck, I guarantee you that no-till is way easier and cheaper, and I'd appreciate it if you call me by my name. It's Dan. Heck, you're a grown man in your own right now. We're neighbors, and I hope friends, so you don't need to call me Mr. Jeffers. Heck, I hear you're a surgeon in the reserves too. Do you want me to call you Surgeon? John said, Heck no, I'm not a surgeon here. Well, I guess I am, but since you're not in the military, I'd prefer you call me John. That's what I mean, son. My grown neighbors and friends prefer to call me Dan. Now let's get this rig over to your place and get to work. I'll help you hook your tractor to this drill and tell you how to use it. I'll stick around for a while and make sure you get started right too. Even with the late start, it only took John 2 days to drill in the beans. He cleaned the drill for Dan and returned it to him. His next project was to come up with the money for fertilizer and get it on the field. Before that, he took several samples from around the field. He took the soil samples to the county agent to analyze and determine what fertilizer mix and line he needed to apply. To his relief, he didn't need to lime but only needed a little fertilizer. He purchased the fertilizer from the local co-op, and after almost 2 weeks of long, hot days of work, John finally found time to sit in front of his cave and relax. He was pleased with his work and looked forward to harvesting a commodity crop in the fall. He leaned back in his chair and listened to the small stream gurgling down the hillside near his cave. The lowing of cattle and the sound of machinery working in one of the neighboring fields were in the background. John sat back and relaxed, letting his mind wander while listening to the peaceful sounds of his country home. John thought about Jenny. He wondered what Jenny was doing. He wondered if she was as active as he suspected. That thought tore his soul apart. He knew he would never find out what she did on her trip unless she or one of her friends let something slip and it got back to him. He was still unsure what he would do when she returned. He was almost sure they were over, but there was a small chance they weren't. He had a lot to think about. His major problem was trust. He had seen the three of them drink and dance on the rare occasion. He suspected Jenny would allow a man to take her home if he wasn't with them. She spent too much time. Some of John's short tours and assignments also caused friction between him and Jenny. Twice during his service, John was told that Jenny had been seen with men. Allegedly, she looked and acted as if she were on a date. His informants told him she was too friendly. During one of his deployments, a friend sent him a letter about Jenny's adventures. He included a pretty bad picture so he could see her. Another friend told John when he returned home that he had personally seen Jenny loving 3 different men simultaneously while he was in Iraq. John asked Jenny about these reports. Of course, she denied ever going out with someone while he was gone. John decided to accept her explanation of her actions from her and her friend, but a small seed of doubt remained. Even of his friends who told him these things hated Jenny enough that they would only tell him what put her in the worst light in John's eyes. Yet, where there's smoke, there's fire. John was almost sure Jenny, at the very least, got a lot of petting and flirting done while he was away. But heck, most people flirted from time to time when they were at parties. After 6 cans of his favorite beer, John reached a conclusion about his life with Jenny. He just didn't trust her anymore. He wasn't even sure he still loved her. He was sure that if he did, the pain from what he perceived as her cheating and the trip would be stronger. John wasn't even sure he loved Jenny enough to marry her, even if she didn't go on the trip. He was almost sure she didn't love him. At the very least, he was sure she didn't respect him. Her actions and caustic remarks had proven that. John decided to move on. He wouldn't seek out Jenny when she returned. He had no intention of going to any of their old haunts, so the odds of seeing her accidentally were slim. He had only brought her to his farm once and was sure she couldn't find him there even if she looked for him after she returned. If she found him, he would play their reunion by ear. However, she would have a hard fight to get back together with him. Summer passed, and John continued to work his small piece of ground. If he wasn't doing something for the reserves, he was working on his farm, or at least on the farm. He had converted the garage bay in his machine shed into a small workshop to work on his equipment. He plowed and planted a small garden to raise some food for the summer. Right now, he was sleeping in the cave where it was cool. He knew he needed to do something about winter. If he returned to college, he would need to rent an apartment. If not, he would need to decide where to live during the cold winter months. One day, John thought about school again. He was tired of going to school. He was happy here on his little farm making short reserve tours. He decided to heck with it. He wasn't going back to college in the fall. Then he began thinking about how to survive the winter. He didn't want to go into town and try to find a place to rent. That would mean finding a job in town, and he really didn't want to do that. Of course, that meant he had to figure out how to make a place snug enough to get through the winter on his farm. John knew he could rig something up in a machine shed, but he didn't like that place. He liked sleeping in his little cave. It was high enough above the stream that he didn't worry about flooding, and the view from the cave entrance was fantastic. He decided to use some old concrete blocks and stones to build a wall across the cave's entrance. He already had electricity in the cave. One of the first things he did when his grandparents left him the farm was to run lines 150 feet from the machine shed to the cave so he could have lights in the evening. The cave entrance under the bluff was only about 30 feet wide and 15 or 20 feet deep. The front was about 10 feet tall. He could pick up enough stones and blocks to wall it off easily. The floor wasn't perfectly level, but he could even it out with some concrete in strategic locations. John decided he had a plan. Early the next morning, he went into town and purchased some materials needed to start work. He ordered some sand and gravel to make concrete and mortar. He bought and took home cement and some building materials he might need immediately. He ordered a nice steel door for the front and 2 PVC triple-pane windows. He also ordered some lumber and metal roofing to build a covered porch for his little cave house. John snorted to himself and admitted this couldn't really be called a true cave. It was more of a big overhanging bluff. It was only about 30 feet deep, and the rear 6 or 8 feet were too low to stand under. John planned to wall off the back part where the wall would be 6 feet tall. He would install another steel door in the rear wall to access the part he walled off. He could use the rear part for storage if needed. The next day, Home Depot delivered his building materials. Once the truck left, John began getting ready to work. The first thing he did after laying out the proposed walls was drill holes into the rock with a hammer drill and set rebar. He formed and poured concrete to level the area where he intended to build his stone wall in the cave floor. While it was setting up, John formed and poured the stem wall for his little porch. He was lucky that it only needed a 30-inch wall at the highest point in front of the cave. After the concrete set up enough to remove the forms, John hauled creek gravel to backfill the area for the porch floor. He then mixed and poured concrete for the 30 by 12-foot porch floor in front of his little cave house. All that work took him a week. It would have taken even longer if he didn't have a front-end loader on his little 45-horsepower tractor. The day John began mixing and pouring concrete for the porch floor, his neighbor across the little stream began mowing the field for hay. When John was resting, he sat and watched the tractor go round and round. He had never seen anyone mow hay so fast. He also couldn't recall ever seeing the person on the tractor. He wondered if it was a hired hand or a special operator. That day, after the field was mowed, the tractor pulled up to the stream and stopped directly across from where John was working. The operator got off the tractor and hobbled to the stream. They removed their shirt as they walked. At the stream, the tractor operator stopped and removed their shoes, then long pants. John stared in surprise at the tractor operator. The tractor operator was a very attractive woman. She looked at John for a moment, then stepped into the stream and waded into a small, deep hole. The deep part of the stream where the woman was wading was really not large enough to swim. It was about 12 feet across and 15 feet long. It was chest high at the deepest part and got shallower from there. Once thoroughly wet, the woman lay on her back and floated in the cool water. John found himself watching instead of working. Finally, he shook his head slightly and returned to his work. For the next 30 minutes, John mixed concrete in his little electric mixer and poured the new porch floor. He decided he needed to finish another 3 or 4 mixer loads, and that would be it for the day. He heard movement and then someone saying, "Hello, I'm Fiona Morgan. I know it's none of my business, but what the heck are you doing here in the old cave?" John said, "Nice to meet you. I'm John Mitchell. I decided to turn the front part of the cave into my home. Right now, I'm pouring the front porch. I really need to keep working before the concrete sets up. I'm not trying to be rude. I just can't let the concrete get too dry or it won't bond to the new pour." "Cool. I used to love playing in the cave when I was a little girl and came down to swim. Do you mind if I look around for a minute or two?" "No, go ahead. I'm almost done here. Then I'm going to wash up and take a dip in the stream myself. I'll even wear clothes tonight since you're here." Fiona turned and looked at him when John said that. She saw him smiling and said, "Well, I hope so. I hate to have to use my formal U.S. Army combat training on you. Do you serve in the military?" "I'm a staff sergeant in the reserves. I've been in a little over 6 years." "What's your MO as military?" "I'm not in the military now. I guess you noticed I don't walk as I should. Sergeant Fiona Morgan, retired U.S. Army, would be more accurate for me, I guess. I was a medic and got a little banged up on a mission. They sewed me back together, but as you can see, I can't move as well as I need to, so they put me out to pasture. Now I'm helping Dad and Mom on the farm while trying to decide what to do with the rest of my life. I never had much interest in college, and there's not much work around here, so I'm just helping out while I decide what to do. Maybe I'll get my EMT certificate and try to get on with the New York EMS as a paramedic. How about you?" "About the same as you, I guess. I told you I was a staff sergeant in the reserves. I did 2 deployments and took all the short tours I could get. I plan to make the reserves my career. I have a bachelor's degree from junior college, but I don't want to go on. These 80 acres belong to my grandparents, and I inherited them from them when they died. I'm lucky Grandpa lived longer than Dad. Everything Dad and Mom had went to pay their bills after they were killed or gone pregnant. What you see here is all I have in the world, and I'm fine with it. I plan to live here in my cave like a hermit, raise what I can on the farm, and take all the short tours I can get in the reserves, then retire. And that's it? Just you and your little piece of ground? Do you ever plan to get married or anything? John laughed and said, well, I plan to get married and settle down with a 9-to-5 job, but she decided she wanted to run around with her girlfriends instead of me, so we broke up. Right now, she's somewhere out west, drinking and messing around with everyone in the world, I guess. Yeah, it would be nice to have a woman, but it's not my priority now. If I find one, I'll see what I do later. John and Fiona talked for a few more minutes. She even had a beer with him before sighing and saying she had to return home to help with the chores. Before she left, she said, I guess I'll see you around again, Sergeant. I hope you don't mind if I come down and swim in the stream now and then, do you? Nope, heck, even if I did, I couldn't stop you. It's your stream, too. Your folks' land borders the creek's south side, so you have as much right to swim as I do. John grinned and continued, besides, I enjoy the view while you wash the dust off. It would be nice if you made some noise when you come down, though. I'm known to swim without clothes. Fiona turned and smiled at John. She looked him over from head to toe and said, I'm known to do that, too. But that was years ago before I learned all you men were just waiting to pounce on us poor, defenseless, naked women. I might just sneak up on you sometime, though. I might enjoy the view, too. She laughed and said, see you later, John. 2 days later, Fiona returned. This time, she was raking the hay into windrows, getting ready to bale. After finishing that hot, dusty job, she once again drove to the little stream and stripped down to her bathing suit. By then, John had finished building the short wall in the back of his cave and was working on the front wall. He watched her work now and then. After using the mortar he mixed up, John put his tools into the water bath and walked to the creek where Fiona was floating. John removed his boots and waded into the stream carrying a pool noodle. Once he was in the deepest part, he floated on the noodle and said, Good afternoon, Fiona. Mind if I join you for a bit? Fiona smiled and said, Not at all. How's it going, John? The 2 young people visited for a few minutes. Then John decided he needed to return to work. He invited Fiona to join him for another beer before she left. Those 2 days seemed to set the precedent for the rest of the week. After Fiona finished her daily chores in the field, she met John at the swimming hole and they visited. After their swim, she went to John's, drank a couple of beers, and saw the work he had done while she was gone. John's little house quickly took shape. The cave room had a 2-level floor. He even managed to bring water in from the old well and set up a bathroom inside. It took a lot of time to chip out enough rock to lay the water and drain lines deep enough to prevent freezing, but he was proud of. The room under the natural rock was 24 by 15 feet. His bed was in the far end of the little room. He built a small kitchen on one side of the front and a sitting area on the other. His bathroom was behind the kitchen. John was glad he installed a small wood stove to heat the room in the winter. He was ready to go, best of all. After the hay was baled, John didn't see Fiona as often as he had when she was working across the stream from him. Still, during the hot weather, she continued coming to the swimming hole at least twice a week. To his surprise, John found he looked forward to seeing her. He was disappointed when she didn't show up. Finally, on Wednesday, when they were swimming in the creek and sipping beer, John asked her out on a date. Fiona looked at John in shock when he asked her out on a date. She said, You're joking, right? John's feelings were a little hurt when she said that. He said, No, I was serious, but if you don't want to go, fine. I just thought we could go out and have some fun. Sorry, I suggested it. Fiona saw the pain on John's face and said, Hey, John, I didn't mean to hurt you. I was just surprised, that's all. You've never given me any indication you thought of me as anything other than a beer-drinking buddy. Besides, I'm a broken soldier. I can't dance and I have trouble walking. My scars are terrible. I haven't been on a date since I was injured, and you just surprised me, Oko. If I haven't run you off completely, yes, I'd love to go out with you, Ok. John found himself smiling. He said, Great, but you have it all wrong, Fiona. You may be hurt and you have scars, but anyone who doesn't see what a wonderful person you are doesn't deserve to date you anyway. I just like being with you. I don't care about the scars, and I never liked dancing anyway. John was not the most observant man in the world, but what man is when it comes to women? He didn't notice the light in Fiona's eyes and face when she heard him say he liked being with her because of her personality and inner beauty, not because of her now marred outward appearance. She felt her heart lift when he said what he did. From his tone and expression, she knew he also meant every word. She felt her spirit rise higher than it had ever been since her injury. She wasn't in love with John, but after that statement, she was on her way to it. John and Fiona continued to see and visit each other throughout the long winter. She was amazed at how cozy his little house under the rock was and enjoyed every moment spent there with John. One spring day, they were at John's again. They sat on the porch, watching a typical spring storm when the wind began to blow much harder and the sky darkened terribly. They heard a loud roar and the porch roof began to shake. John watched in amazement as the roof began to bow. The rain was coming down almost sideways and blowing all over the porch. Suddenly, he realized what was happening and grabbed Fiona. He dragged her toward the front door, yelling, "Tornado! Come on, hurry up. We need to get inside and under cover." John didn't stop when they entered the main room of his little house. John pulled Fiona to the back of the house to the little room he used to store his root crops and other bulk food supplies. They closed the door and sat on the floor. Once the door was closed, they could barely hear the storm's roar. Soon they heard. John waited another 10 minutes, then opened the door to his home and allowed Fiona to follow him out. One of the front windows was broken out, and part of the porch roof had flown through it. Rain and debris had blown into the room. His bed was damp but not terrible. The porch roof was gone, blown away by the wind. John stepped out into the now gently falling rain and looked toward his machine shed. It was gone too. Part of the roof had fallen on his. Fiona walked up beside John and wrapped her arm around his waist. She rested her head on his shoulder and said, "Oh, John, I'm so sorry. Come on." First, they headed to the shed. Most of John's equipment was bent and damaged from having the building fall on it before the wind blew it away. Some smaller parts were blown around the yard. He would have to clear debris before determining whether it was damaged enough to be inoperable. He also had a lot of trees to cut down and clean up from storm damage. However, it was obvious that this was not a very strong tornado. John's machine shed was more destroyed than blown away. Sure, some of the metal siding and roofing were completely gone, but much of the building was lying on the equipment stored inside. Fiona and John walked to the top of the bluff above the cave house and surveyed the storm's path. Fiona gasped and grabbed John's arm. She said in hysteria, "John, it looks like the storm hit our farm too. The house and barns are damaged. I have to get back home and check on Mom and Dad." She ran or hobbled as fast as she could to her truck. John ran to catch up with her. When John got to Fiona, she was trying to climb into her truck. He grabbed her and led her to his truck. John ran to catch up with her. When John got to Fiona, she was trying to climb into her truck. He grabbed her and held her. He said, "Wait, Fiona, you can hardly see out your windshield. Come on, let me grab the chainsaw, some other tools, and a first aid kit. Then we'll go in my truck." John and Fiona rummaged around in his half-destroyed shed until they found the chainsaw, fuel, and oil for it, some ropes and chains, a come-along, and a couple of heavy steel pry bars. Then they drove out of his lane as fast as they could and turned toward Fiona's house. Twice they had to stop and cut trees out of the road before continuing. Because they had to clear the road, it took almost 45 minutes to drive the 2 miles to her house. It would have been faster to walk across the fields, except they would have had to cut one of the fences. When they arrived at Fiona's house, they saw the house and farm buildings were as destroyed as John's garage. However, the buildings were more destroyed than blown away. Fiona ran around frantically, calling for her parents. Finally, she and John heard faint cries coming from under the house's wreckage. John backed his truck as close as possible, and they began moving debris from where the noise was coming. Fiona was crying as she frantically worked on the wreckage. There was a large tree laying against the corner of the house. After they cut the tree away, John saw a broken basement door partially blocking the stairs to the basement under the house. The cries were coming from the basement. They finished clearing the door, and Fiona rushed down the stairs, calling for her parents. John followed her down the stairs carrying a flashlight. When John walked up to Fiona and put his arm around her waist to comfort her. After the initial euphoria of finding each other safe, Fiona's father, Seth, began climbing out of the basement. When he reached the top of the stairs, he stopped and looked in shock at his farm. Fiona and her mother stood on either side of him, holding him around the waist. John walked up to them and stood silently for a while. After the three began slowly walking around the house, surveying the damage, John followed Fiona. The rain had begun falling harder, so he said, "Look, folks, it's getting dark and the rain is getting heavier again. Why don't you all come to my place and spend the night? We could decide what we need to do in the morning and get started on the recovery. My place isn't the most fancy or comfortable for all of us, but at least it'll be dry and warm. I'll need to cover the broken window with something, then we'll build a fire and make ourselves as comfortable as possible." The following morning, Fiona and her mother cooked breakfast on John's little wood stove. While they ate, the four friends discussed how to recover from the disaster. John insisted that Fiona and her parents stay with him until they could make something for themselves. After dinner, they separated. Seth, Bridget, and Fiona returned to their place in Fiona's truck. John drove to town to purchase materials to replace his broken window and porch roof. He also reported his loss to his insurance agent. They promised to send an adjuster out in the next day or two. John was told not to begin any restoration until after the adjuster arrived. He was allowed to replace the window only because it would protect his home from further damage. John also mentioned the damage at the Morgans' house. They had also insured the vehicle through the same agent, so he promised to have an adjuster out the same day. John returned home with new glass and spent the rest of the morning installing it. Afterward, he worked in his machine shed until he got his tractor out. Some of the sheet metal on the tractor was bent, but otherwise it. Now he was glad the insurance agent had talked him into taking out a policy that covered his equipment, the machine shed, and his little shack. Shortly before dark, Fiona and her father returned to John's with a mattress, freezer, and some bedding and clothing for everyone. They also had canned food in the truck. Bridget had taken the family truck to town to buy groceries. They started the generator and powered the freezer to keep the frozen food cold. John also brought out his generator to power the appliances until the power company restored service. The news said their area would likely have service restored later the following day. The next 10 days were busy. The insurance adjuster came and John was awarded $100,000 to rebuild the machine shop and 2 smaller outbuildings. He also received $155,000 for the damage to his equipment and $7,500 for the damage to his small house. Most of the settlement would go to the labor needed for the restoration. John would pocket much of that as profit because he intended to do almost all the work himself. He decided with the money he was awarded to increase the size of his home, including the porch that had been 12 by 30 feet. Now he would add a new porch that wrapped around 3 sides of the building. It would cost more than $7,500 to do the work himself, but not much more. He then used the cave part of the house for a bedroom and the new addition for the living room, kitchen, and office. He even built a larger bathroom inside the cave with access from both the new addition and his bedroom. John began digging the foundation for his new porch 2 days after receiving the promised amount from the insurance adjuster. He used salvaged materials from the destroyed buildings for forms. He poured the concrete and was ready to begin construction when he received the reimbursement check. He explained to Fiona and her family what he planned to do, and they were all for it. John planned to grit his teeth and use concrete to build his new home wall. Then he would stone the outside. He hated spending the money, but he thought it would be worth it now that he had it, and it would be worth it if another tornado hit him. Besides, it would make the house easier to heat and cool. Also, the concrete would only cost about $2,500 if he did the work himself and bought ready mix so it could all be done in one pour. He had worked with concrete in the army. John poured the concrete and waited until it was set enough to remove the forms and begin roofing his new addition when his plans went awry. He got that all-too-familiar phone call from his reserve unit. His unit was being activated for active duty in Iraq again. He would be gone for a year. While he liked the money, he hated. When John told Fiona and her parents that he was being activated for active duty again that evening, Fiona said, "Oh crap." Then she ran to him to give him a hug. John quickly told the 3 Morgans that they were more than welcome to continue living in his house until their home was restored. They had finished cleaning up the site of their home and were waiting for the company to come in and erect a steel building that would then be turned into a new home for the family. While they waited. The night before John was to leave, to his great surprise, Fiona came to his bed in the middle of the night. He woke up when she climbed into bed with him. She kissed him passionately and immediately cuddled up to him. He pushed her back slightly and said, "Fiona, we can't do this now. Your parents are sleeping right there, and they—" This wasn't the first time John and Fiona had made love, and John was sure her parents knew about their intimacy, but John was still concerned about doing it almost under their noses. Fiona, on the other hand, was not to be dissuaded. She gave John a heart-stopping kiss and hissed, "I don't care. Mom knows we're lovers, and I'm sure Dad knows too. I want one last full night with you." Of course, once the deed was done, the 2 lovers fell back to sleep and didn't awaken until Bridget began cooking breakfast. When John got out of bed, Bridget poured 3 cups of coffee and set them on the small table. She smiled as a very embarrassed John came. Bridget took pity on John and said, "I wondered why you 2 weren't sleeping together before this. I know how you feel about each other, John. Seth and I are fine with it. Fiona is a grown woman, and if she wants to spend the night with her man, a man we all think highly of, then we have nothing to say about it." Finally, the day came for John to report to his unit. All 3 Morgans watched John leave for war again. Fiona would return his truck after the unit deployed, then bring it back to the farm. He put her name on his checking account so she could pay his bills while he was gone. She and her father would also farm his small acreage for the year while he was away. The first 3 days at the reserve center were typical for a unit mobilizing. There was paperwork, and more paperwork. There was also last-minute loading of equipment that needed to be shipped with them. Much of the larger equipment they would be using was already in the theater, as was much of their smaller equipment that had been shipped earlier. On the day of their departure, John was surprised when Fiona showed up with her parents to send him off in the bus before they left. There were many issues to go over at the mobilization station. All the soldiers received medical and dental exams. The personnel files were updated. There were legal and other briefings and some concentrated training and weapons qualifications. John took advantage of the legal update during this deployment. He wrote a will leaving all of his belongings to Fiona. He never told her about his decision. After 3 weeks at the mobilization station, John's combat engineer unit was loaded on the planes and sent to Kuwait for a short period of acclimation before they moved into the country to replace the engineering unit they were replacing. That replacement occurred over a 30-day period. Then John's unit took full responsibility for the engineering functions in their assigned area in support of local, Allied, and U.S. forces. John's unit arrived in the early summer. By midsummer, he suffered from the 130-degree Fahrenheit temperatures. It was horribly dry and dusty. They worked long days and many nights doing everything an engineer unit does. They cleared routes, built schools, roads, and other facilities. They were shot at, cursed at, and always overloaded with work. John loved it and hated it. Many days he took the opportunity to call home and talk to Fiona. Love began creeping into their conversations. John found himself thinking about her more and more. He wondered if he truly loved. They had almost completed 3/4 of the deployment when disaster struck. The unit was working on a road in the mountains when terrorists attacked. After almost 30 minutes of continuous fighting, John's platoon sergeant was injured. John was the next senior sergeant and found himself being pulled into the job. He had just fully grasped the location of all of his platoon members when the platoon leader was also injured. Now John was commanding what was left of the engineering platoon fighting for their lives. John saw the fires slack off in one sector he was responsible for and led an attack into the terrorist positions. He and the 13 soldiers remaining to him moved into the... Finally, the support requested when the contact report was sent arrived. Gunships concentrated their fire in support of John and his men. Within 10 minutes of John's counterattack, the terrorists were broken and began a retreat defeated. By the time the rain... After that action, John was left in the position of platoon sergeant. He proved not only to be gifted and highly skilled in combat, but also an excellent platoon sergeant in the other aspects of his job. By the time he returned home, he had been promoted to E7 platoon sergeant. He was awarded the Bronze Star for leadership during the terrorist attack. Finally, the day all deployed reservists looked forward to arrived. They were relieved and returned to the United States, where their unit was demobilized to return home. As had become the norm in many towns when their National Guard or Reserve unit returns from deployment, John's unit was greeted by crowds of happy friends and relatives when the plane landed. When the plane landed, John's unit was greeted by crowds of happy friends and relatives. To John's surprise, Fiona rushed into his arms when he worked his way through the crowd, hoping to find his truck waiting for him so he could return to his little farm and relax in peaceful surroundings. John almost fell when Fiona rushed into his arms. She wrapped her legs around his hips and her arms around his chest and pressed her lips to his. "Oh, John, I missed you so much. I'm so glad you're home," she said. "Come on, I have your truck. What do you want to do first? It's almost noon. I'd really like to have a good meal. What they served us was fine, but I want to visit all my favorite restaurants as soon as I can. It was fine in the U.S., but I want to visit all my favorite restaurants as soon as I can. I think I miss pizza and good steaks most of all. However, right now, I'd like to order a pizza from the Pizza House. That was one of my favorite places when I was in college here in town. I've been dreaming of their homemade pizza almost since we got to Iraq. After that, I just want to go home and sleep for." When they arrived at the Pizza House, they took John's favorite table. John and Fiona visited each other, holding hands across the table when a very pregnant waitress came up. She pulled out her order pad and turned to take their order. When her gaze fell on John, she dropped her order pad and paled. Then she almost screamed, "John, oh my God, I've been looking everywhere for you, sweetheart. Where have you been? It's so good to see you again. I've really missed you." She leaned over and tried to hug and kiss John. John looked up and saw Jenny. He jerked back to avoid her attempt at a hug. It had been more than 2 years since they had broken up, and she was the last person on his mind. He said, "Hi, Jenny." He glanced at her pregnant belly and continued. Jenny ran away in tears and disappeared into the kitchen. Soon another waitress came to their table and sullenly demanded their order. John almost hated to give it to her, fearing they might do something in the back to harm the pizza or make it unsafe to eat. Heck, In the past, it was known that Jenny did things like that in fits of anger to get even for some slight. He looked at Fiona and said, I think maybe we'd better just leave. I lost my appetite after talking to your friend. Without a word, Fiona got up and waited for John to rise. She stepped to him and kissed him, then said, Honey, I need to go to the ladies' room before we leave. I'll be back in a minute. The waitress looked at Fiona in anger, then stomped back to the kitchen. John stood by the front door waiting for Fiona. After a few minutes, he heard angry voices coming from the restaurant's rear. They seemed to come from the hallway leading to the restrooms. He moved so he could see farther down the hall and saw Fiona and Jenny staring at each other. Their faces were full of anger. They were talking animatedly. John moved toward the women. He was about halfway across the floor when he heard Jenny say, I still want to know what you're doing with my fiancé GC, you little crippled witch. I heard his unit was called up, but now that he's back, I'm marrying him, so you need to get lost. Fiona laughed and replied, Honey, he wouldn't marry you after what you did to him if you were his last chance at marriage. I can't believe you were so darn stupid you left his bed to go have fun with your floozy friends for a whole summer. I know he promised you that if you did, you'd never be his woman again. What? You didn't believe him? Fiona looked at Jenny's belly and continued, What happened? You needed daddy for your little brat. And when you saw John, you thought you could con him into paying the bills. I wonder if this is the only little bastard you have. Maybe you found another one on your little tramp tour, huh? Now I suggest you just get back into the kitchen and hide or get back to work. My man and I are leaving, but before I go, I want to give you a little advice. I'm a retired army surgeon. I learned how to handle little witches like you when I was pissed off. I can guarantee you wouldn't want to make me mad. I'd get royally mad if I thought you were trying to steal my man. You had your chance, and you blew it. Now get over it, and find another. Fiona turned and started toward John. When she reached him, she was blushing slightly and took his arm. She looked up at John and said, Sorry you heard that, John. I hope you don't think I overstepped my bounds. Now can we find something to eat, then head back home? Suddenly, I really want to get out of this town. When John turned into the lane leading to his home, Fiona was really fidgety. She was almost bouncing on her seat. John thought her expression was a mixture of excitement and fear. Finally, just before they came into sight of his yard, he asked, Fiona, what's wrong with you? Why are you suddenly so nervous? Well, you remember how you gave me the authority to write checks on your account to pay your bills while you were gone? I sort of spent a lot of your money, and now I'm afraid you might be a little upset about it. Dad and Mom thought it was a good idea, and I guess we just talked each other into doing it. I'm sorry if I did wrong. John watched Fiona trying to figure out what exactly she had done that she thought had upset him. He was almost at the spot where he rolled and parked his truck with the alarm scene registered on his mind. His house was finished. It had a roof, a covered porch on 3 sides, and everything was just the way he wanted it before he left. There were flower beds and shrubbery and a nice, well-kept yard. His machine garage was rebuilt and even a little larger than before. He stopped the truck and sat, staring in shock at his little farm. He felt his stomach begin to knot up. It appeared that Fiona must have spent all the money he got from insurance and possibly more. He turned to her, feeling his face crumple in anger. He struggled to talk politely. He said, Fiona, it looks like you spent all my insurance check and maybe even some of the army pay they sent to my accounts. You knew I planned to do the work myself and save some of the money. I didn't want to spend it all on labor. I wanted to upgrade my equipment too, if I could. Fiona interrupted his conversation. She said, No, John, I didn't. I wouldn't do that. I did exactly what you said you intended to do. I tried to do only what you said you wanted for the house and machine shed. I didn't spend a cent on labor. Everything here was done by Dad, Mom, and me or free by some of our friends and neighbors. A lot of neighbors came to help out. Fiona pushed John out the door of his truck. Once they were outside, she grabbed his hand and began pulling him toward the house. She rushed to the door and waited for him to enter the room built on the slab that was his first porch. She walked to his desk and pulled the check register from it. She handed it to him then. John was shocked at the balance shown in his accounts. Fiona had spent only half of what he estimated the work would cost if he did it himself. He sat down in his office chair and flipped through some invoices and report pages. He turned to Fiona and asked, How did you do this? You spent just over half of what I figured the materials alone would cost to finish the work. Fiona smiled and said, Well, I kind of made deals with some of the suppliers. Thanks to your service, we got a lot of material at dealer prices or at deep discounts. We told the dealers you were deployed to Iraq and we were restoring your farm buildings damaged during the tornado before you deployed. They offered us some really good deals when we explained the labor was donated as a thank you to our local hero. Sometimes they even donated things they said would upgrade the repair or substituted more expensive things than we ordered. Fiona looked at the stunned John and held out her hand. She continued, "Come on, honey, I want you to look at the machine shed we built for you, too. That I promised Mom and Dad we'd come to their house for supper." John followed Fiona across his yard and machine garage in shock. Everything was just as he had described while talking to her about his plans. In some cases, it was even better. Fiona and her crew had even installed compressed air lines at several strategic locations in the shed. There was a pit in the floor so he could work under the equipment if needed. The pit could be covered for safety when not in use. After they finished touring the new machine garage, Fiona took John outside and pointed out the fact they even cleaned up the tornado-damaged trees. She showed him the new shed built behind his house where all the firewood was stored to be out of the weather. John was in shock when Fiona took him back inside the house and showed him the bedroom in the old cave. She gently closed the door and turned to John. She walked to him and wrapped him in her arms before kissing him. At first, the kiss was gentle. Then it became more demanding. John felt Fiona's tongue slip into his mouth. She pressed her entire body into him and moaned. He moaned and began gently caressing her body. Clothing began to fly, falling to the floor in a random fashion. John and Fiona fell onto his large bed. John was lightheaded. He was lost in a mire of lust. His entire universe consisted of the beautiful creature taking pleasure from him and giving him pleasure in return. They moved together. They had wild sex. John leaned over and kissed Fiona, then sighed and rolled to the side. He lay on his back and pulled her against his naked and rapidly cooling body. She laid her head on his shoulder and threw her damaged leg across his thigh. Then she snuggled into him. Fiona looked up at John's face and sighed, then whispered, "I." John turned his head slightly and gently kissed Fiona. He whispered in return, "I love you too, Fiona. After seeing and feeling what I have with you, and know I never loved Jenny. I don't think I even knew what love was until I met you. Before you bucked that field into bales and got the hay in, I think I loved you more than I ever loved Jenny. I enjoy just being with you, sitting quietly, making love or working." After his short nap, John crawled from bed. He quietly slipped out from under Fiona and headed to the bathroom. After finishing, he returned to the bedroom and found Fiona gone. He turned, walked into the main part of the house, and found. Fiona looked up at John and smiled. She said, "Why don't you go out on the porch and enjoy the morning while I finish the coffee, honey? I'll bring you a cup when it's ready." John did as Fiona suggested. He sat and watched the sun rise over the trees. He could see the light beams shining through the mist rising from the creek. He felt relaxed as he listened to the cattle and birds singing. John was surprised when Fiona approached and handed him the coffee. She was as naked as he was. She smiled down at him and sat in the chair next to him. To his surprise, she scooted the chair to the porch edge and sat down on it facing him. She began teasing him. She looked him in the eye and smiled. Fiona smiled at John again and licked her lips after taking her first sip of coffee. She smiled again and asked, "See anything you like, soldier?" John grinned and said, "Oh yeah, I really miss the view across the creek to your folks' hayfield." For a moment, Fiona looked shocked. Then she grinned back at him and muttered, "Oh, you old rogue, I should go get dressed. I bet that would serve you right." "No need for that. Now that you mentioned it, I see other things worthy of my attention." John cocked an eye at Fiona and quite obviously looked her over. "You know it's dangerous to tease a man who hasn't had sex in the wilds of Iraq as long as I have." Fiona laughed and said, "I'm really hoping for that. I think we need to drink our coffee and introduce them to each other again before we have breakfast and go to Mom and Dad's." After a rousing reintroduction, John and Fiona took another short nap before she cooked and ate what John called a real breakfast. Fiona made biscuits, scrambled eggs, ham, and hash browns. Of course, there was more coffee for dinner. She quickly loaded the dishwasher before they dressed and headed to her parents' house. They arrived just as Seth and Bridget were sitting down to dinner. Bridget looked up as the young couple walked into the kitchen. She jumped up and began setting the table for two more so they could eat. Fiona looked at me guiltily and said, "Don't do that, Mom. We had breakfast just 15 minutes ago. Neither of us is hungry." "Fiona Morgan, what did you do that made John wait until noon for breakfast? I thought I raised you better." Seth snorted, then laughed. Bridget gave him an angry look. Then she blushed. She quickly looked at Fiona and saw she had a deep blush. Her mouth dropped open in shock. Then she, too, blushed deeply. "Oh," she whispered. She quickly turned back to her dinner and began eating. Fiona walked to the cupboard and took out 2 glasses. She put ice in them and then filled them with iced tea. She walked to John and handed him one. Before stepping away, she quickly and gently kissed him. She sat at the table beside her mother and reached her left hand over her mother's plate. Bridget looked at her hand and squealed. She grabbed Fiona's hand to hold it still while she looked at the engagement ring. After her parents finished dinner, Fiona helped her mother clear the table and wash the dishes. Seth took John to sit in the yard and visit with him. When they left that day, John and Fiona took her things back to his house. They continued to work the little 80-acre farm. He stayed in the reserves. In addition, they helped with the work on the little 80-acre farm. He stayed in the reserves. In addition, they helped with the work on Fiona's parents' farm. As the years went by, they completely took over running both farms. After the birth of their second child, the two families switched homes, and Seth and Bridget lived in John's old cave home until both passed away. John retired from the United States military after 40 years as a senior surgeon. John and Fiona's younger son, in turn, continued running the combined farms. John and Fiona returned to the cave home and allowed their son and his family the larger main house. During his life, John made and kept 3 major promises. He promised Jenny that if she went off to have fun, he would never be in her bed again. He promised to love, honor, and cherish Fiona until death did them part, which he did. He promised her father he would care for his daughter, which he did. Thank you for watching. What do you think of John's decision to leave Jenny and find love with Fiona?